It's now time for Energy Insights, where you get an inside view and local perspective of all the oil and gas progress going on in the Mid-Ohio Valley. This program is brought to you by the Southeastern Ohio Oil and Gas Association and can be heard every Saturday on WMOA AM 1490, FM 101.3, JAWS Country FM 100.9, and ESPN Radio AM 630 and FM 92.9. Here's Johnny Wharf, your local host.
Saturday morning and Energy Insights is the program brought to you by the Southeastern Ohio Oil and Gas Association. Pleased to be joined by Jerry James again, and just a wealth of knowledge, I think, when it comes to the industry, not only in the area, but certainly worldwide. And maybe for the listeners, Jerry, just kind of take us on a spin of a year in review. I think people like to do this time of year, so maybe you can do that as it relates to the industry globally.
Well, Happy New Year to you, John.
Yeah, you as well.
It was kind of an interesting year, you know. We started with oil around $75 a barrel, this time at the beginning of 2022. Oil started surging up as the world came off of COVID and the United States wasn't increasing production for the first time in well over a decade. Then Russia invaded Ukraine and oil went up to 130, and then the Biden administration and the allies released all the oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and brought the price of oil down. And China had some additional COVID lock-ins, and they reduced demand. So we're really right back to where we started last year. Oil is where it ended, going in the course of the year. So it went up from 75 to 130. Gasoline went over $4, and it's back down. Now, the future is going to be a little bit different in the past, but that's where we're at. Natural gas. Go ahead. Yeah,
kind of crazy to think about that you could guess. We get into the situation where, oh my goodness, the sky's falling, right? And then all of a sudden we're back to where we can fill up a tank and not worry so much. But who knows what tomorrow will bring, right?
Well, we can kind of think the moves that people did 40 years ago, like say back during the Reagan administration and really the end of the Carter administration, where they formed a Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and they filled it with, I think at one time it had 800 million barrels of oil in it.
Yeah.
And they filled it for after we had the Arab oil embargo in 1973, and then we had the Iranian Revolution. And it's hard for everybody to remember right now how bad the 70s were. And if you weren't alive, you probably don't really realize that the 1970s were probably next to the Great Depression, the most difficult economic time in the last 100 and some years. And so that was their reaction to it. Now, key that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was supposed to be reserved for an interruption in supply, which was what had happened in 1973 and again in 1979. All we were really experiencing last year was high prices because of tight supplies. We really weren't short oil at any point. We weren't standing in gas lines like we were back in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And so we may have brought the price down, but we may have kind of cut our nose off to spite our face if we really have an interruption in supply in the near future, because now the reserves are the lowest they've been really since Reagan's first administration, when the thing started to be filled.
You talk about, the crisis and the Ukrainian-Russian conflict and those things. Did those impact us immediately as it relates to the oil and gas, or is it something that takes time?
They did. The trouble with the futures market, and, having lived with it my whole life, it can go against you both ways. It can raise the price, or right now we're seeing, for instance, natural gas. With 2 weeks of warm weather, the price of natural gas dropped a third since Christmas. It can go against you. The futures market is controlled by speculators on oil, and they look at the tea leaves and try to predict what the future is, hence it's the futures market. So, for instance, like when Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia is the largest exporter of hydrocarbons in the world and one of the largest exporters of oil, next to probably Saudi Arabia. So all of a sudden they're thinking, well, geez, one of the largest exporters in the world just got into a war with its neighbor, something we haven't seen since World War II. And that got to interrupt the price of oil. So the markets kind of reacted. There wasn't any actually physical shortage at that time. There was just this perception of what's going to happen. As it turned out, the Russians' production has held up pretty well to date. And so there hasn't been a shortage, and that was my comment earlier. When we released all the oil as Strategic Petroleum Reserve, it's not like we were actually having a shortage. We were just perceived shortage. And I think the markets would have probably calmed themselves down a little bit. But
interesting
that's
stuff.
what they did.
That's great information, and that's what we try to do each Saturday morning here on Energy Insights, brought to you by the Southeastern Ohio Oil and Gas Association. And if you would be so inclined to join us next week, we'll maybe try an outlook and do our best anyway about what's ahead for the industry. But as always, thank you for your time. Energy Insights on a Saturday morning, and pleased to be joined again by Jerry James. Last week we did our best at a year in review, and holy smokes, what a year 2022 was. It kind of, if you want to recap as in the nickel tour of last week's show as it leads into this year, and at a best guess, Jerry, what's in store for our future here?
Well, kind of recapping what we did last week, and like you said, it was kind of a volatile year, even though we ended where we started. So we started the year talking about the oil markets. We started the year with the economy recovering from COVID, and oil demand was going up and the price was going up. And then Russia invaded Ukraine, something we've not seen since World War II, and that drove the price up even more. The president and the allies decided to try to bring the price down. They would empty all the petroleum reserves, which they did, and it brought the price back down. And so Russia's oil hadn't been interrupted yet last year, and so we ended up with the price ending the year, 2022, where it started. Mm-hmm. And so now we've got all these factors going into next year, and we'll see how all this plays out.
Well, so if we look ahead, and I know we can't predict what's going to happen in an hour from now, let alone what's going to happen during the course of the year, but kind of draw it into where our feet are, here in the Shell Crescent region, and what you anticipate might happen in the ongoing months, if not further ahead, if you want to even take it further than the year.
Yeah. Well, there's really two businesses. When you look at the oil business alone, that's a world market. And so I think the oil markets, even though we could be looking at a recession this year, and if we do that, demand will slow down and probably moderate prices. But as you look out, we could be looking at some very difficult years in the oil markets from what we did last year. We emptied out the petroleum reserves, and now we don't have that reserve to put on the market. China's recovering from COVID, so that demand will go up.
Yeah.
And then we've put all these, we've imposed all these sanctions on Russia and brought out the Westerners and the Western technology, and Russia may not be producing oil. So when you look at the oil side of this thing, in the next few years, that could get high. But natural gas is really what we produce locally, and that's a totally different market than the oil markets because it's not quite as much an international market. And I always tell people it's an ill wind that doesn't blow someone some good. So what's happening in Europe? And Europe was having energy problems prior to the Ukrainian invasion. Most people don't realize that. But if you look at the fall of 2021, they saw energy prices spike almost 4 or 5-fold in Europe because they're further along on the Green New Deal than we are. And so they're having troubles with their energy delivery. Now, what that means locally, we are starting to see European countries coming here to look at building new facilities in the Shale Crescent region because there's an inherent advantage building on the third largest supply of natural gas in the world. And that gives you an inherent economic advantage. And put that third in perspective, the only two places ahead of us in the world is Russia and the rest of the United States. So we're starting to see some economic opportunities here related to what the Europeans have done on the energy front.
As it relates to, you mentioned the sanctions, how do we compare? And again, it probably changes with different administrations, but to other countries in terms of being a friendly place to relocate and build and try to expand?
Yeah. Historically, U.S. has been a great place to do business and has been pretty business friendly. I mean, a good example right now is look at natural gas prices. If you look at natural gas prices, and this was happening even pre-Ukraine, that's what everybody needs to understand. They're higher since the Ukrainian war, but they were headed up before that. Natural gas was 5 to 10 times higher in Europe than what you could purchase it for locally. And that gives us a huge competitive advantage.
And this is purely, you mentioned where it was and where it is that just purely climate driven in terms of where the how it warmed up?
Yep. It really is two things. Is that if you look at Europe, and it's interesting, we have a chart we always use for shale-crest, and it shows the top 9 countries in the world on producing natural gas. And those 9 countries are over 70% of all the natural gas in the entire world is just in 9 countries. But when you look on the list, the only Western European country is Norway, which is number 9. And we here locally in Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, the area we call Shale Crescent, we produce almost 3 times as much natural gas as Norway. So the Europeans really were kind of running out of energy anyhow because they just didn't want to develop it. And so that gives us a huge competitive advantage over the Western Europeans.
Hey, if we could go back to the 80s and into one of your college classes at Merida College, what would your professor think if he knew you were sitting here talking like this right now?
He would be astounded, but first we got to go back to the 70s because it's been that long. But who would think? I don't think anybody would have guessed that the United States would be the number 1 oil and gas producer again. And 2, who would guess that when you look at that this region would be such a huge producing region? Because the entire oil and gas business, most people don't realize this, the entire oil and gas business in the world starts in Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania.
Yeah, it's good stuff. We appreciate it. Getting our own little education here on a Saturday morning. As always, Jerry, just appreciate your time and your friendship with our radio station, and wish you the best in the new year. I'm sure this isn't the last time we'll talk.
Good talking to you.
Thank you for listening to Energy Insights, brought to you by the Southeastern Ohio Oil and Gas Association. Tune in every Saturday morning on WMOA Local Radio, JAWS Country, and ESPN Radio, as Johnny Wharf brings you your local and inside perspectives going on in the oil and gas industry right here in the Mid-Ohio Valley.